"Sir, my baby sister is freezing." 5 words. And they destroyed him. The December wind cut through the city streets like a blade, carrying snow that had shifted from beautiful to brutal in the span of a single hour. Charles Hawthorne pulled his tailored black overcoat tighter as he moved through Henderson Park, his mind still turning over the board meeting that had run 2 hours past schedule. Acquisition numbers. Quarterly projections. A rival company bleeding market share. At 42, he had built Hawthorne Industries from a calculated risk into a multi-billion-dollar empire. But power had come at a price he rarely admitted, even to himself. His penthouse apartment was immaculate. And empty. His life was full of achievements and devoid of warmth. He was cutting through the park only because his driver had called in sick, and Charles Hawthorne did not wait for car services. He walked 15 blocks. Alone. As he always was. The Christmas lights strung through the bare, frost-white trees should have looked cheerful. Instead, they only sharpened the hollow feeling he carried this time of year, the quiet reminder that the holiday season had become nothing more than another stretch of time to endure. That's when he heard the voice. "Excuse me, sir." Charles stopped. He turned to find a small boy standing beside a snow-covered bench, no older than 7, maybe 8. The child wore an oversized sweater, worn thin at the elbows, far too large and far too light for a night like this. His chestnut-brown hair was damp with melting snow. His pale cheeks burned red from the cold. But it was his eyes that stopped Charles completely. Wide. Hazel. Frightened, yet fighting with everything he had, not to show it. "Sir." The boy's voice cracked, just barely. "My baby sister is freezing. I don't know what to do." That's when Charles noticed what the boy was holding. A baby. Wrapped in a thin, faded blanket that had no business being outside on a night like this. A tiny girl, golden curls, round cheeks gone red and raw, her small body trembling. She was crying. But the cries were weak. Fragile. Quieting. Charles knew with cold certainty that quieting was the worst sign of all. "Where are your parents?" he asked, already reaching for his coat. The boy's jaw tightened, the brave face of a child who had been holding the world together for hours. "Mom left us here," Isaac said. "She said she'd be right back." But that was, before it got dark. He glanced down at the baby in his arms. "I tried to keep Nora warm. I've been trying. But she won't stop crying, and now she's getting quiet." He looked back up at Charles, hazel eyes wide, voice barely above a whisper. "My mom always said, when babies go quiet, that's bad." Isaac didn't have anyone. He was 7 years old, standing in the snow, holding his baby sister, and you were the first person he asked for help. Not his mother. Not a neighbor. Not a teacher. You. And right now, Charles almost kept walking. If you want to find out whether he stops, whether Isaac and Nora make it through that night, whether one man's cold, empty life becomes something worth living again, hit that subscribe button. Because the next chapter drops, and I promise you, what Charles does in the next 10 minutes will either break your heart or restore your faith in people. You don't want to miss it. Isaac doesn't have time for you to forget. Charles Hawthorne had negotiated with governments. He had walked out of rooms that would have broken lesser men. He had never, in 42 years, felt the particular weight of a 7-year-old's eyes. He felt it now. He pulled his overcoat from his shoulders without a word. This was the moment Charles Hawthorne's life changed. Not in a boardroom. Not at the signing of a deal. Here. In the snow. Holding a baby girl who weighed almost nothing, and mattered more than everything. Charles moved without thinking. He crossed the distance between them in 3 strides, shrugging his overcoat from his shoulders before the boy could say another word. The coat was cashmere, custom-tailored, worth more than most people's monthly rent, and he wrapped it around both children without a second thought, tucking the fabric tight against the baby's trembling body. She was so small. That was the thought that hit him first. Not the cold, not the inconvenience, not the 1,000 reasons this was not his problem. Just, she is so small. One hand. That's all it would have taken to carry her. One hand, and she would have disappeared inside his palm. "What's her name?" Charles asked, his voice lower than he intended. "Nora." The boy shifted her carefully, like he'd done it 10,000 times. Maybe he had. "I'm Isaac." Charles crouched down to their level, something he hadn't done, genuinely, physically lowered himself, in longer than he could remember. He pulled back the edge of the faded blanket. Nora's face was red and raw, her golden curls damp against her forehead. Her lips had a tinge to them that made something cold move through Charles's chest that had nothing to do with the weather. She was still crying. Barely. The sound was thin now. Reedy. Like a signal slowly losing power. That's what scared him most. Not the tears, the fading of them. How long have you been out here? Charles asked, looking up at Isaac. The boy thought about it with the seriousness of someone twice his age. Since before lunch. Mom said. He stopped. Swallowed. She said she'd be right back. Charles said nothing. He didn't trust what might come out if he opened his mouth. Instead, he did the only thing that made sense. He reached into his breast pocket, pulled out his phone, and dialed. His private physician picked up on the second ring. Richardson. I need you at my address in 20 minutes. A pause. No. Don't ask questions. Just come. He looked down at Nora's quieting face. 20 minutes. She needed to hold on for 20 minutes. Hold on, he thought, though he wasn't sure if the instruction was for her or for himself. Charles didn't wait for a car. That decision came fast and clean, the same way his best business decisions always did, not from deliberation, but from the sudden, absolute certainty that waiting was not an option. Every minute Nora spent in the open air was a minute she didn't have. He scooped her from Isaac's arms in one careful motion, adjusting the cashmere coat around her like a cocoon. She made a sound, small, weak, barely a protest, and he held her closer to his chest, instinctively, the way something deep and wordless told him to. Isaac watched him with those hazel eyes. Measuring. Not surrendering trust, just considering whether it was safe to. Stay close to me, Charles said. Both of you. He didn't look back to see if Isaac followed. He already knew he would. The boy had been holding his world together alone for hours. He recognized someone who looked like they had a plan. The 15 blocks to his penthouse felt different with a baby against his chest. The city noise, the distant traffic, the holiday music bleeding from a storefront 2 streets over, the mechanical indifference of it all, seemed suddenly obscene. He walked faster. Isaac's smaller steps worked double time beside him, silent, determined, matching his pace without complaint. Tough kid, Charles thought. The kind of tough that doesn't come from privilege. The kind that gets built in the cold. By the time they reached the lobby of his building, Marcus, the night doorman, had already risen from his desk with a particular alertness of someone sensing that the evening had shifted categories entirely. Mr. Hawthorne. Cole upstairs. Tell them to turn the heat up. Charles didn't slow down. And I need 2 warm towels in the main sitting room. Now. He didn't explain. He never explained. And the people who worked for him had long learned that when his voice dropped to that register, quiet, absolute, no edges, you simply moved. The elevator doors closed behind them. Isaac stood beside him, still and straight, watching the floor numbers climb. Then quietly, so quietly Charles almost missed it, is she going to be okay? Charles looked down at Nora's pale, still face. Yes, he said. He said it like a command. Like the universe had better be listening. Dr. Richardson arrived in 19 minutes. Charles had been counting. He'd converted the home office into something functional, cleared the long leather couch, layered it with the warmest blankets his housekeeper could find, positioned the floor lamp close for heat and light. It wasn't a hospital. But it was warm, and right now warm was the only medicine that mattered. Richardson was a compact, silver-haired man who had been Charles's personal physician for 11 years. He'd treated boardroom stress and business trip exhaustion and the particular physical toll of a man who treated sleep as a negotiating position. He had never walked in to find an infant being unwrapped from a cashmere overcoat on the office couch. To his credit, he didn't miss a beat. He worked quietly and efficiently, checking Nora's temperature, her pulse, her color. His hands were steady and certain, and Charles stood back and let him work, arms crossed, jaw tight. Isaac sat in the corner chair, perched on its edge, both feet flat on the floor, watching Richardson with the focused intensity of someone who needed to understand exactly what was happening to his sister. Moderate hypothermia, Richardson said finally, not looking up. She's responsive. Temperature is low but recoverable. Whoever kept her wrapped and out of the wind made a difference. He said it clinically. Charles looked at Isaac. Isaac didn't react. He just nodded, like he'd already moved past needing credit and straight to needing answers. Is she going to wake up and cry again? The loud kind. Yes, Richardson said, a faint note of warmth breaking through his professional tone. The loud kind. Very soon, I'd expect. Something in Isaac's face cracked open, just for a second. Relief, raw and unguarded, before he pulled it back behind those careful eyes. Charles pulled a chair close and sat across from him. Isaac. He kept his voice even. How long were you 2 in the park? The boy looked at his hands. Since around noon. Mom put us on the bench and said she had to do something quick. A pause. She took her bag. The big one. She only takes the big one when she's not coming back soon. The room went very quiet. Charles held the boy's gaze and said nothing, because some truths deserved a moment of silence before anyone dared respond to them. The call came at 10:47 p.m. Charles stepped into the hallway to take it, pulling the office door half closed behind him so Isaac wouldn't hear. The voice on the other end belonged to Detective Priya Chun, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who owed Charles a favor from a corporate fraud case he'd helped her department quietly resolve 2 years ago. He'd called her the moment Richardson had stabilized Nora, asking her to run a quiet check. No report filed yet, just information. She hadn't taken long. The mother's name is Diana Morgan, Chun said. We picked her up 6 blocks from the park, 40 minutes ago. Possession charge. She's processing now. A beat. She had no idea we had the kids. Or she didn't ask. Charles said nothing. He turned toward the window, looking out at the city lights below. All that brilliance, all that indifference. Child services will need to be notified tonight, Chun continued, her voice careful now, threading the line between procedure and the favor she clearly sensed he was about to ask. Standard protocol means emergency foster placement before morning. There's a shortage of sibling placements right now. They'd likely be separated. There it was. Charles had built an empire on identifying the exact moment a situation required him to stop observing and start acting. This was that moment. Give me an hour, he said. He spent it on the phone. His family attorney first, pulled from dinner, apologetic, then professional when he understood the stakes. Then a family court judge he'd supported quietly during a fundraising campaign 3 cycles ago. Then the director of a child welfare nonprofit whose entire East Wing bore the Hawthorne Foundation name on a brass plaque. He didn't threaten. He didn't manipulate. He simply made clear in the measured tone of a man who understood exactly how much weight his words carried, that 2 children needed to remain together tonight, in a safe and stable environment, and that he was prepared to be that environment, formally, legally, immediately. By midnight, a temporary emergency guardianship order was processing. Charles walked back into the office. Nora was sleeping, warm and breathing steadily. Isaac was upright in the chair, fighting sleep with everything he had, refusing to close his eyes until someone told him it was safe. It's handled, Charles said quietly. You're both staying here tonight. Isaac studied him for a long moment. Then slowly, he leaned back in the chair and let his eyes close. That small surrender of trust hit Charles somewhere he hadn't felt anything in years. Nora announced herself at 3 a.m. Not gently. Not with the thin, fading whimper from the park. This was full-lunged indignant, and, as Richardson had promised, gloriously loud. Charles was awake before the second cry, moving down the hallway in the dark with the particular alertness of a man whose body still hadn't accepted that the crisis was over. He found her in the makeshift nursery his housekeeper had assembled from a spare room, a borrowed bassinet, extra blankets, a small lamp left on low. Nora was awake and furious, her small face scrunched with an outrage entirely disproportionate to her size. Her golden curls were wild. Her blue eyes were open and blazing. Charles picked her up. That part came easier than he expected. The bottle did not. Richardson had left formula and basic instructions. What he had not accounted for was the gap between written instructions and a man who had never once, in 42 years, prepared a bottle for an infant. Charles stood at his marble kitchen counter, the one designed for a private chef, stocked for business dinners, measuring formula with the focused concentration he usually reserved for hostile takeovers. Too much water. Start again. Temperature check. Wrong. Again. You're doing it wrong. Charles turned. Isaac stood in the kitchen doorway, hair flattened on one side, oversized sweater hanging off one shoulder. His eyes were sharp despite the hour, moving immediately to Nora in Charles's arm before settling on the formula tin. The line, Isaac said, crossing the kitchen without invitation. He pointed to the measuring scoop. You only go to the line. Not over. He looked up. Can I hold her while you fix it? Charles handed Nora over without hesitation. The transformation was immediate. Isaac shifted her to his left side, her head against his shoulder, and began a low rhythmic shushing that he clearly hadn't learned from anyone. He'd invented it himself, out of necessity, out of love. Nora's cries softened within seconds. Charles stood very still and watched a 7-year-old do what he couldn't. He finished the bottle correctly this time. When he offered it to Isaac, the boy gave Nora back with the careful authority of someone transferring something irreplaceable. She likes to be tilted, Isaac said. A little. Not too much. Charles tilted her. A little. Not too much. The kitchen went quiet except for the small, steady sounds of Nora feeding. Outside, the city hummed its cold, indifferent hum. In here, something else entirely was happening, something Charles didn't have a boardroom word for. He thought distantly that he might need to find one. The story broke by 6 a.m. Charles discovered it the way he discovered most unwanted things, through his phone, which had accumulated 43 notifications by the time he checked it after Nora's second feeding. Someone in his building had talked. Or someone at the precinct. It didn't matter who. What mattered was that his name was already attached to words like guardian angel and billionaire saves abandoned children across 3 major outlets and climbing. His PR director called at 6:15. Then again at 6:22. Then sent a text in capital letters that Charles read, noted, and set face down on the kitchen counter. By 7 a.m., his communications team had drafted a statement, a media strategy, and a suggested photo opportunity. Charles deleted the email without finishing it. There was a more pressing matter. Isaac had screamed in his sleep at 4:30 a.m., a sharp raw sound that had brought Charles to the guest room door in seconds. He hadn't gone in. Something told him not to. Instead he'd stood in the hallway and listened as Isaac talked himself back down in the dark, murmuring to himself in a low, steadying voice. "It's okay. Nora's here. It's okay." Over and over, until silence returned. Charles had stayed in the hallway longer than necessary after that. Now Isaac sat at the kitchen counter, eating toast with the methodical focus of someone who had learned not to take meals for granted. Nora was propped against a folded blanket nearby, watching her brother with the serene attention of someone for whom he was the entire world. "The people on your phone," Isaac said, without looking up. "Are they mad?" "They want to take pictures," Charles said. Isaac considered this. "Of us?" "Yes." The boy's jaw tightened slightly, that same instinctive guardedness Charles had noticed in the park. "I don't want Nora's picture on the internet." Charles looked at him for a moment. Then he picked up his phone, called his PR director, and said 4 words, "No photos, no statement," before hanging up. Isaac watched him do it. He didn't say thank you. He just reached over and broke a small piece of toast for himself, refocusing on his plate with the quiet dignity of someone who had just decided tentatively that the man across the counter might be worth trusting after all. It started with a sheet. Charles had asked Isaac, somewhere between Nora's afternoon feeding and the quiet stretch of early evening, what he wanted for dinner. Isaac had shrugged with the practiced indifference of a child who had learned not to want things too specifically. Then, after a pause so small Charles almost missed it, he'd said, "We used to make forts. Before." He didn't explain what before meant. He didn't need to. Charles Hawthorne had negotiated billion-dollar contracts. He had restructured failing companies and outmaneuvered men twice his experience. He had never built a blanket fort. He approached the task with the same focused intensity he brought to everything, pulling cushions from the sitting room sofa, draping sheets over chairbacks, engineering a structure that would not, under any circumstances, immediately collapse. Isaac supervised. Seriously. With notes. "That side's too low," he said, pointing. "Nora can't see out if it's too low." Charles adjusted it. Isaac inspected it. Granted a small reluctant nod of approval. They settled inside with Nora between them, propped against a cushion, batting at the edge of a dangling sheet with a grave concentration of someone conducting important research. The lamp outside cast the whole structure in a warm amber glow. Somewhere in the transition from afternoon to evening, the city outside had gone quiet, or maybe Charles had simply stopped hearing it. "Are they going to take us away?" Isaac asked. He asked it the way he asked most hard things, looking straight ahead, voice level, already braced for the answer. Charles didn't reach for reassurance. He didn't soften it or reframe it or deploy the careful language of someone managing a situation. He turned and looked at Isaac directly, the way the boy deserved to be looked at. "No," Charles said. "I won't let that happen." Isaac was quiet for a moment. "People say things like that." "I know," Charles said. "I'm not saying it because it's kind. I'm saying it because I have the resources to make it true. You and Nora stay together. Whatever it takes." Isaac looked at him then, really looked, the full weight of those hazel eyes, and something in his small face shifted. Not quite belief. But the first, careful edge of it. Nora grabbed the dangling sheet and pulled it triumphantly. Isaac laughed. Short and bright and completely unguarded, the laugh of a child who had briefly, just for a moment, forgotten to be afraid. Charles stored the sound somewhere he hadn't used in years. The courtroom was smaller than he expected. Charles had imagined family court the way he imagined most things outside his world, large, imposing, designed to communicate authority. Instead it was a modest room with fluorescent lighting and scuffed wooden benches and a window that looked out onto a gray February sky. It felt nothing like the boardrooms where he'd spent the better part of his adult life. It felt, somehow, more serious. He sat at the petitioner's table in a charcoal suit, deliberately understated, his attorney had advised, and waited while the opposing counsel outlined the irregularities of his application. Single man. No prior parenting experience. No biological connection to the children. A lifestyle, they suggested carefully, optimized for professional achievement rather than domestic stability. Charles listened without expression. He had spent 20 years perfecting that face. When it was his turn, he stood. He had prepared remarks. 3 pages, precise and well-structured, anticipating every objection. He looked at them once, then set them down, and spoke without them. He told the judge about 3 a.m. formula and getting it wrong twice. About a 7-year-old correcting his measurements with the patience of someone who couldn't afford for him to fail. About standing in a dark hallway listening to a small boy talk himself down from a nightmare he should never have had to have. About a blanket fort and a laugh so unguarded it had rearranged something fundamental inside him. He said that he had built a company that employed thousands of people, had sat across from presidents and foreign dignitaries and men who controlled markets, and that he had learned more about trust, and about what it meant to be responsible for another life, in 8 weeks with Isaac and Nora Morgan, than in 42 years of every achievement he had ever been proud of. The courtroom was very quiet. "Mr. Hawthorne," the judge said, after a moment. She was a measured woman with careful eyes that had clearly seen every variation of human desperation this room could produce. "Do you understand that this is permanent? That you are not rescuing these children, you are becoming their father?" Charles didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said. "I understand the difference. And I'm choosing the second one." Charles just said yes. But the judge hasn't answered yet. And somewhere outside that courtroom, Isaac is sitting on a bench. The same way he sat on that bench in the park. Waiting. Trusting that this time, someone actually comes back. He's been let down before. By the one person who was supposed to show up. Every single time. And right now, the only thing standing between Isaac and Nora and that system that would have separated them, is one man's answer. And one judge's decision. If you've made it this far, you already know you care what happens. Don't pretend you don't. Hit subscribe. Because the next one is that's going to make you ugly cry. I'm not sorry. Isaac waited in the cold for hours. The judge looked at him for a long moment. Then she made a note. 2 years changed everything and nothing. The penthouse was the same address, the same square footage, the same view of the city that had once looked back at Charles like a mirror, all glass and cold precision, reflecting a life that was full and hollow simultaneously. The bones of the place hadn't changed. Everything inside them had. There were crayon marks on the lower section of the hallway wall that his housekeeper had strict instructions not to touch. A collection of picture books had colonized the bottom shelf of his study, displacing quarterly reports that had once felt urgent and now felt like artifacts from someone else's life. Nora's laugh, enormous, disproportionate, the laugh of someone who had inherited no instinct for restraint, had a way of filling rooms that Charles had once moved through in silence, barely disturbing the air. He stood in the doorway of the sitting room on a Tuesday afternoon in March and watched. Isaac was on the floor cross-legged, assembling a block tower with the focused architectural ambition of someone who had learned in the past 2 years that it was safe to build things and expect them to stay. Nora sat opposite him, now 3 years old, golden curls escaping every direction, her blue eyes tracking each block with an intensity that suggested she was waiting, patiently, strategically, for the precise moment to dismantle it. "Don't," Isaac said, without looking up. Nora's hand froze mid-reach. She considered this. Then she added a block to the top instead, with great ceremony, and looked to her brother for approval. Isaac examined the addition seriously. "Good," he said. "That one works." Nora beamed like he'd handed her the world. Charles didn't move from the doorway. He had learned in 2 years of mornings and nightmares and 3 a.m. bottles and blanket forts and courtrooms and slow, patient dinners, that some moments were not meant to be entered. Only witnessed. Only kept. The adoption had been finalized that morning. There had been paperwork, signatures, a judge's warm handshake, and Isaac's careful, deliberate smile, the smile of a boy who had decided, after considerable evidence, that it was finally safe to believe something good was permanent. Charles had held it together until the car ride home. Then he hadn't. He looked at the crayon marks on the wall. The picture books. The block tower climbing steadily toward the ceiling while Nora plotted and Isaac built, and the whole impossible, unplanned, irreplaceable thing continued, loud and warm and thoroughly, completely alive. He thought about a park bench. A December wind. A voice cracking in the cold. "Sir, my baby sister is freezing." 5 words that had ended one life and started another. He wouldn't have changed a single second of it. He almost kept walking. Remember that. A man who almost kept walking is now a father. And 2 children who were left on a bench in the snow have a home that will never, ever let them go. If this story moved you, don't just feel it and scroll away. Subscribe. Share it. Because somewhere out there is someone who needs to believe that people like Charles exist. Maybe that someone is you.